Good afternoon, Mr. Millett. Are you ready to continue?
Yes, I am, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much.
In that case, would you ask us to bring Mr. Martin back in, please?
Yes, thank you. Thanks.
Good afternoon, Mr. Martin.
Hello, sir.
Are you just checking you can see me and hear me all right? All right,
Yes.
you ready to continue? Thank you. I'll ask Mr. Millett to continue then. Thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Millett.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Martin, we were on the subject of BR 135, second edition 2003. I want to return to that, please. Now, we know that the process of reviewing BR 135, which had originally been published in 1988, came about as a direct result of the 1999 Select Committee recommendation that we looked at on Thursday. That's correct, isn't it?
Yes.
And that was the purpose of the survey, the literature review, and the 2001 experimental testing that we've now covered under CC 1924. Yes?
Yes.
Yes. So it all led to that. Now, we know, I think, also, and correct me if I'm wrong about this, that you and Dr. Colwell conducted the review of the first edition of BR 135 when preparing the second edition.
Yes.
Yes. What was your specific role in that process?
In reviewing the original,
Yes.
I don't recall producing a commentary or anything. I think it was just familiarisation with the old document.
What did you conclude from your review of the 1988 original?
I'm not sure I can remember what the conclusion I came to at the time. I remember it being not a very user-friendly document, and its advice in terms of using combustible insulation materials. It had a kind of rule of thumb by which it said that it might be reasonable to use combustible insulations beneath rendered insulation materials where cavity barriers were installed. So it had a kind of quite a simplistic rule of thumb, but it was not that clear to the reader.
Now, is it right that during your review of the 1988 version, you and Dr. Colwell, and I suppose speaking for yourself, you became familiar with its contents?
I guess so at the time. I'm not sure I can remember much of it now.
Now, Sarah Colwell told us in her statement, you don't need to go to it, it's page 30, paragraph 192, that as part of the development of the second edition, you and she agreed that the first edition could be used as a suitable basis for that second edition. Is that correct?
I don't remember that conclusion. My recollection is that we tried to structure BR 135 so that it broke down into an introduction of the objectives of controlling external walls and the general hazards associated with external fire spread, and then to talk about in general terms the different phenomena and those factors that a designer ought to consider, and then at the back of the document was the pass-fail criteria.
Right. Now, when you were considering whether the first edition, the 1988 edition of BR 135, was a suitable basis for the second edition, what factors did you take into account?
I'm sorry, I don't recall looking at it in those terms, so I'm not sure I can answer that question.
Well, let's look and see what Sarah Colwell says. If we go, please, to her statement. It's BRE 30047571, page 31, paragraph 196, please. She says this: Brian Martin and, let me just wait, there. Brian Martin and I worked collaboratively on the development of the second edition Together we A, reviewed the text of the first edition that formed the basis of the draft for the second edition, B, updated content based on developments in the testing of external cladding systems and mechanisms of fire spread, including principles for the design of fire barriers arising from the MHCLG-sponsored research programme underpinning the development of Fire Note 9 and BS 8414 Part 1, and C, included Annex A, which was taken from the Assessment of Performance section of Fire Note 9, which had previously been published. How did you go about conducting the review of the first edition, which is described here in paragraph 196A?
Sorry, can I go back to the previous page?
Back to page 31. Quite right. Review of the text of the first edition. You see, that's what she says you and she worked collaboratively on. How did you go about conducting that review? And what did you do?
That's not how I recall the process that we went through, or the work that I did. I remember, as I say, we felt that we could give more helpful advice or more generic advice than was in the original.
Well, let's break it down. See if we can take it step by step. She says, together we reviewed the text of the first edition, etc. Now, did you or didn't you review it together? Is she right about that?
I'm sorry, it probably depends on what you mean by the word reviewed. We would have looked at it. There wasn't a systematic exercise of considering which items of text were worth retaining or not. I don't remember doing that anyway.
Well, even more simplistically, when you started work on the second edition, did you read the first edition?
Yes.
Did you make any comments on the first edition?
A general conclusion that I didn't think it was very helpful to the reader.
Right. So you read it, you understood it presumably, you analysed it. Did you discuss it with Sarah Colwell? Did you share your views about the first edition?
We must have done, yes.
Well, you must have done. She says you did. What I'm asking you is, what do you recall of that process?
Very little. As I say, I remember us discussing how a new BR 135 should be structured so as to be most useful to its reader.
Right. Did you have any substantive input, contribution to make in the review of the text? Did you go through it and go, I don't think that's any good, we think that's misleading, we think that's good and should be retained? Did you bring any qualitative judgment to the text to make a decision about whether it should be changed?
I think it was more fundamental than that. I think it was more about restructuring it.
Well, that's just index, shape, moving things around. What I'm interested in is whether you brought your mind to bear with all your experience that you've told us about, so that you could add value to the new edition based on a judgment that you were making about the adequacy of the first edition. Or am I making assumptions?
I find it difficult to remember exactly what we did because it's a long time ago. The bit I remember most was that there are sections in the old document where it set out an approach to designing, an acceptable approach for using combustible insulation in certain cladding systems. And that was, if you like, contrary to the approach that we were now taking, which was if you were using a combustible insulation material, you should be using the full-scale test. So the new 135 removed those provisions.
Right. I may come back to that in a moment, but just on the process of, do you remember when reviewing the first edition, do you remember how you and Sarah Colwell decided which parts would be retained, which parts would be deleted, which parts would be amended? How did you go about that?
I don't remember. Sorry.
Did anybody supervise your work, your contribution to the editing of BR 135?
I think Dr. Cole and I talked through how we thought it should be presented. Ultimately, we presented that to the advisory group, I think.
I mean, I know it's a long time ago, but normally when one writes a publication, particularly a publication that is then woven into the very fabric of the approved document, you might remember something about the process of how you went about that.
I'm sorry, I don't.
You don't. Let's go to BR 135 in its first edition. BR 401077. And I want to show you the first page first of all. There it is. And it was entitled Fire Performance of External Thermal Insulation for Walls of Multi-Storey Buildings. So it was about insulation. And if you go to page 4, please, I want to show you the right-hand column towards the bottom of page 4. And there's a little heading, Regulatory Aspects. Can you see that?
Yes.
And it says this: control over the external surface of walls of buildings, particularly those of multi-storey flats, to avoid ignition and flame spread, which might endanger the lives of residents above by breaking down effective compartmentation, and that's defined, is currently controlled by reference to tests specified in BS 476 parts 6 and 7. However, these tests only provide information on surface fire behaviour. The overall fire performance of a ventilated cladding system or insulated assembly, incorporating independently supported weathering finishes and complicated reveal details, can only be investigated under actual fire conditions on a full-scale building facade. I think I can pause there. Now, it was still, I think, the case, as you've confirmed, that in 2000, that those matters were controlled by reference to the BS 476 Part 6 and 7 tests, weren't they?
Yes.
And in 2003, when the second edition of BR 135 was published, that remained the case, yes?
Yes.
Yeah. By 2003, as we've seen, I think a decision had been taken not to follow the Select Committee's recommendation to substitute the full-scale fire test in place of Diagram 40, but instead only to pose that test as an alternative option in ADB. We've seen that, yes?
Yes.
Yes. Now, take it from me that the paragraph I've just read to you from the first edition here does not appear in the second edition of 135, nor anything like it. Can you explain why that is?
Well, it really goes to the heart of the purpose of BR 135 to some extent.
Which is what?
To provide a full-scale approach to testing the behaviour of a cladding system.
Well, why does the absence of the words I've just read to you, as you put it, go to the heart of the purpose of BR 135?
I think to some extent, I'm trying to think back to that time. BRE had taken the view that the large-scale testing was the best option. Perhaps we didn't consider it was necessary to spell that out.
Given that the Select Committee's recommendation to replace the Class 0 with non-combustibility and an alternative of a full-scale test, if you're going to use anything that isn't non-combustible, can you explain why these sentences that I've read to you on this page here of the first edition were removed in the second edition in 2003?
I don't remember a conscious decision to remove them. I think, as I say, I think the approach was to some extent to start from scratch.
Well, there must have been a conscious decision to remove them, given that you were, as she says, reviewing the first edition, updating it and amending it and deleting parts of it. There must have been a conscious decision, surely.
If there was, I don't remember it.
Do you accept, looking at what is said here, that the tests and conclusions from the CC 1924 project, as we've seen this morning, demonstrated, in fact stated in terms, that BS 476 Part 6 and its Class 0 designate were unreliable and unsatisfactory tests for external fire spread.
I think we were drafting the document at that time thinking that someone was coming to BR 135 because they'd already come to that conclusion and were looking to try and pass a large-scale test.
So, was it your understanding that the purpose of BR 135 was to provide criteria for a full-scale test to those people who were producing products that couldn't achieve Class 0 and therefore wanted a different way of getting their products above 18 metres? Was that your understanding?
I think so at the time. I think that's what we were thinking, yes.
So your thinking was it to design a test where you could badge certain products because they passed the criteria here for use above 18 metres in circumstances where they couldn't achieve it through the linear route? I think
they were focused. It was mostly focused on systems where the insulation material would be combustible in some way, which was really where most of the focus was.
So, just so I understand this, was the purpose of this to produce a test and criteria on a pass-fail basis, which, if passed, meant that you could put insulation which was not of limited combustibility above 18 metres. Was that the purpose of it?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think that it was which is to some extent what the original BR 135 was doing. Is it provided guidance to people who wanted to use polymeric insulation on taller buildings. It gave an approach to doing that.
Well, we've seen. I showed you the title to this document, which is about insulation, but nonetheless, the then authors thought it appropriate to draw attention under regulatory aspects here to the limitations in BS 476 and 477, limitations which you and at least the BRE and government knew full well by 2003 had been proven in full-scale tests and bench-scale tests. So my question again, I'd like an explanation, if you could give me one, as to about why it was that the passage I've read to you disappeared and did not reappear in BR 135 second edition.
I don't remember a conscious decision to remove it.
Was it because you and the BRE, or you and government, did not want to draw industry's attention to the limitations of Class 0, even though you knew what they were?
No, I don't see why we would want to do that.
Because industry would make a fuss if you did?
No, that wouldn't be a motivation.
Would it not?
No.
Was it not a motivation, as we've seen, behind coming to Class B as the equivalent transition point or transposition point for Class 0 when it came to the harmonisation programme? The need to keep the market unrestricted?
No, it's a completely different question, I think.
The same question, because it's about not upsetting the market. So I'm asking you again, was one of the reasons why these words disappeared from here the need to preserve Class 0 to keep your UK market sweet?
Absolutely not.
That's a trenchant answer. We'll come back to that then in due course. But let's just see what Dr. Smith says in her statement. BRE 405624, page 8. I think we've seen this before. I'll show it to you again. It's a theme I'm going to keep coming back to. But here Dr. Smith says, and this harks back to the Knowsley fire in 1991, in the middle there, this was a clear recognition that it was not possible to rely on small-scale fire test data on individual elements, materials or components in a cladding system as a means to try to predict and thereby control the fire performance. Reliance on small-scale fire tests had been tried and had been shown to be inadequate. Now that was her view, that was always her view. Was the the section I've shown you on the limitations of testing to BS 476 Part 6 and 7 that we see in the first edition, 1988, omitted from the second edition so as not to draw attention to the limitations which Dr. Smith identifies here?
No.
Why are you so sure about that?
I've never been asked to suppress a piece of information, and I never would do such a thing.
But it does, though, doesn't it, in effect, suppress the information by its effect. The outcome is that you end up with a second piece of guidance in second edition in 2003, which does not contain the clear warnings about the defects and inadequacies of Class 0 that appeared in the first edition.
I accept that it's an omission, but it's certainly not a deliberate attempt to hide something.
So what else could it be? Accidental?
I think so, yes. I don't think we...
Right.
Probably at the time we didn't think that text was necessary, or we just missed it. I don't know.
Whereas that got missed, did it? So that's a second occasion on which the dangers of Class 0 got missed by you and Dr. Colwell, yes?
It's not something I'm proud of, but the idea that we deliberately suppressed information is just something I can't possibly entertain.
All right. Now, it's right, I think, isn't it, that the second edition of BR 135 was the subject of a consultation process?
Yes.
And Dr. Colwell has told us that both you and she managed that process. Is that right?
Yes.
Yes. Was the work split evenly between you, or was it? Did you take some parts and did she take others?
I wish I could remember in detail. I can't. I imagine we would have talked through it.
Who supervised or approved the work you were carrying out on the consultation responses?
Well, Dr. Colwell was the project leader, so ultimately it was her responsibility, I guess. And we would have reported to Dr. Smith, I think.
Right. And what was your role in the consultation? She was leading it. What were you doing?
I wish I could remember in detail, but I imagine we would have talked through the comments.
And how did you go about addressing the comments and the feedback received? Do you remember?
I'm sorry, I don't remember.
Can you explain how the process worked? I mean, given that the BR 135 was not going to be a British standard, did the BRE basically run and manage the process itself, or was there more collaboration?
I can't remember the structure we adopted.
Did the department play any role in the consultation process?
I'd be surprised if it didn't, but I wish I could remember more detail, but I can't.
Following the consultation, do you remember who had the final say or final sign-off in relation to the content of the second edition of BR 135 as published?
Well, it would have been signed off by Dr. Smith, and given that it was funded by the department, I would assume that we would have run the draft past the department before publication.
Do you remember whether Dr. Smith and you ever discussed any elements of the text before it was published?
I don't remember.
Who supervised your work on BR 135?
I think it would have been Dr. Smith.
Right. Do you remember what she did by way of supervising you?
No.
Did she ever spot check your work? Did she come and talk to you about your draft? What did she do?
I'm sorry, I have very little recollection of that piece of work now.
Do you remember this? Whether the consultation process revealed any concerns or resistance from any quarters of the industry? Or stakeholders more widely, perhaps?
I don't remember any sort of big pressing issues.
I'd like just to ask you then some questions about the detailed criteria in BR 135. Can we turn to the document, please? It's BRE 405554. Excuse me. Now, it still bears the same title, Fire Performance of External Thermal Insulation for Walls of Multi-Storey Buildings. And if we go to page 2, we can see your name with Dr. Colwell. And if we turn, please, to page 22, we can see Annex A. This is the performance criteria and classification of BS 8414 Part 1 2002. And just for chronology's sake, there was no Annex B until 2013 because at this time, 2003, only Part 1 had been adopted as the British standard.
Yes.
Yes. So, and you look at the performance criteria, you can see they're set out. And in the paragraph break and then 3 bullets, it says this: the performance of the system under investigation is evaluated against 3 criteria. First bullet, external fire spread. Second bullet, internal fire spread. Third bullet, mechanical performance. And if we go on to page 23, we can see the failure criteria set out. And there they are. External fire spread, and I can summarise, I think. It's right that failure is assessed if, or is adjudged to have happened, if an external thermocouple at level 2 exceeds 600 degrees for 30 seconds or more within 15 minutes of the start of the test. Yes?
Yes.
Yes. And internal fire spread, failure is adjudged if an internal thermocouple at level 2 exceeds 600 degrees for 30 seconds or more within 15 minutes of the start of the test. Same.
Yes.
Yes? And the mechanical performance, no failure criteria have been set. Yes?
Yes.
But it says that details of any system collapse, spalling, delamination or flaming debris should be included in the test report. The nature of the mechanical failure should be considered as part of the overall risk assessment when specifying the system. See A7 and then A7 set out below. Now, before we move on to some more detailed questions about those criteria, some very, very basic questions. And I asked this before, but in the light of what I've just shown you here, more specifically, what was the purpose of BR 135 in this second edition?
It was to provide pass-fail criteria for a BS 8414 test and provide general guidance to designers of cladding systems.
Right, now on the second part of that answer, just try and break that open a bit, what risks precisely was BR 135 getting at in this edition, second edition?
It was the risk of vertical fire spread on the external surfaces of the building, spreading to other parts of the building.
And what are the objectives of the large-scale testing referred to?
It's measuring the potential for fire to spread
Right.
to other parts of the building.
Now, in the light of that, I think you'll agree, but correct me if I'm wrong, that BR 135 and the large-scale testing that it refers to are addressing what one might call the generic risk of flame spread across the surface and in cavities, but leaves it to the competent professional to assess the nature and acceptability of that risk in relation to any particular fire safety strategy. Is that correct?
Insofar as BR 135 on its own is concerned, yes, I suppose that's
Yeah. Can you explain why or on what basis the performance criteria that we can see here under external and internal fire spread were selected?
As I understand it, I think they reflected the pass-fail criteria that had been adopted for the Fire Note 9 test. As I recall, the 600 degrees C is regarded as a proxy for the presence of flames. So if you're measuring 600 degrees C, it's likely that there are flames present at that height. So it's a more reliable source than asking a technician to observe flames. And they won't be able to see internal flame spread. So that's why 600 degrees C was adopted, I think.
And what's the rationale behind the failure criteria? 600 degrees for 30 seconds within 15 minutes of the start time. What was the rationale for those timing figures?
I think the 30 seconds is something that's probably a pragmatic approach. When you look at, again, I'm not an expert in fire testing, but when you look at fire test data, you find that the thermocouple readings fluctuate quite violently. And so you could get a very small peak, which might not be spotted or So they're looking for if you like, something reliable that they can put in the pass-fail criteria. So if the temperature's over 600 degrees for 30 seconds, then you've got a definite reading, if you like. So that's a kind of pragmatic laboratory sort of approach. I think the 15 minutes related to the time at which you'd expect the fire in the source room to experience intervention by the fire service.
Do you know why the pass-fail criteria in BR 135 in this edition and second edition were not specifically and expressly linked to the issues addressed in the main body of the document?
I think they are. I'm not sure why you think they're not.
Well, they're just hanging there in the annex. There's no cross-reference here to the kinds of risks or things which these criteria are addressing. Do you accept that? Maybe you don't.
I think I understand where you're coming from. I think the annex with the pass-fail criteria was drafted in the form of a standard that a laboratory would use. So it's drafted in those terms.
I see.
Whereas the rest of the document is attempting to be a helpful advisory document to people designing cladding systems.
Now, I'd like to show you the evidence Dr. Smith gave us about this. Can we look, please, at the transcript for day 236 at page 112? 112. Day 236, page 112. At line 1, I'll just read this to you, just down to line 10. Question, did you ask your colleagues, what is it that tells me that 600 degrees is the limit for adequacy as opposed to 500 degrees? And I should just say the context of this was in addressing the functional requirement in B41. Answer, okay, so when you look at the body of evidence, and I mean, I don't recall the precise discussion, but they looked at lots, the outputs from the tests that were carried out, and we're looking to specify the criteria that would ensure that products you didn't want to pass didn't pass, and those that should have passed did pass. Now, that last part of that answer, the outputs from the tests that were carried out, and we're looking to specify the criteria that would ensure that products that you didn't want to pass didn't pass, and those that should have passed did pass. Do you agree with that? Do you agree that that's what was being looked at?
In terms of the 600 degrees, so the way it had been explained to me is the 600 degrees was there as a proxy for the presence or otherwise of flames. I guess one of the things that Dr. Colwell and the experimental team were doing was looking to see whether that was working in practice.
Well, do you agree with what she says here, that the outputs were looking to specify the criteria that would ensure that products that you didn't want to pass didn't pass, and that those that should have passed did pass? Do you agree with Dr. Smith in her evidence there?
I mean, that's clearly one of the things that you would have been considering is are you content that this test is rejecting those things that you think are a problem?
Well, what were the products that you, as you put it, thought were a problem?
That's the side of the work that Dr. Colwell led on, really.
Well, you just, I think, agreed with Dr. Smith. My question for you is, let me try it differently. What were the products that you didn't want to pass?
I don't think I held a view on that, I think, because I wasn't involved in the experimental work.
Right, so can we take it that you cannot agree or disagree? Is this right? That the criteria we're looking to filter out desirable products from undesirable products, even though that was what Dr.
Well, but that's clearly what criteria are for. That's the function of a criteria. That's not I wasn't involved in the thought process as described by Dr. Smith there. I remember talking to Dr. Colwell and she explained that the 600 degrees was adopted as a proxy for the position of the presence or otherwise of flames, and that seemed logical and sensible to me.
So, to your way of thinking, it wasn't a set of criteria that was designed to weed out those kinds of products that have been pre-selected as desirable as against those products which had been pre-selected as undesirable.
Oh, I see. I'm not aware of any pre-selection. I'm not sure that would have been possible.
Did you ever go to government and ask them the following question? We're designing a new full-scale test for external fire spread, but we need to know what you think, what you understand or propose by the word adequate in the functional requirements so that we can design a test that meets it.
I think that's the conversation that was probably had when they were developing Fire Note 9. I certainly wasn't involved in a conversation like that.
Did you, when you wrote this with Dr. Colwell, did you make the assumption that if the criteria that you had designed or you had selected with her and put your name to were met with a pass, that would meet the functional requirement?
I'm not sure if I thought of it in those terms. I think it had already been decided to adopt Fire Note 9, which became BS 8414, and these were criteria which had essentially already been established. I think we looked at them again and concluded that we thought they were reasonable.
Reasonable for what purpose, though?
As an acceptability criteria for an external wall construction.
For what purpose?
For achieving reasonable standards of safety.
Well, what about the functional requirement?
Well, that is what the functional requirement is.
What I'm really trying to get at here is what, at the time, did you think, when you put your name to this document, was the relationship between passing, satisfying the criteria, and meeting or achieving the functional requirement?
Based on what I'd seen, I took the view that passing this test would deliver compliance with the functional requirement.
Right. Generically?
Yes.
So without regard to the height, use and position of the building?
I think deciding whether you imposed these criteria would be linked to those things. Having imposed them, at no point did we ever discuss the potential for multiple classifications. I know that's been discussed since, is whether the test could deliver more than one classification. So you've got the 600 degrees limit, or maybe a more onerous one or a less onerous one, depending on what you were looking to achieve. But at the time, the Fire Note 9 test delivered a single classification, and that was considered to be the right thing to do at the time.
Why not tell the reader that the fact that a system achieves a pass under BR 135 and therefore meets the alternative guidance does not of itself mean that the functional requirement is met for any given building?
I suppose to some extent that's what that third criteria is saying, where it says it needs to be taken into account for the risk assessment for the project. Ultimately, whatever test data you've got as a designer, you should still be asking yourself whether there aren't other factors you need to consider.
Well, that's third criteria is mechanical performance, where there wasn't a criteria. Yes? So that can't be, what you just said can't be right, can it, with respect?
I think in general it is. I think as a design, it's the nature of all fire tests is that you ought to consider them in the round. There's a danger of getting a test result and just accepting it without using your own understanding and intelligence. There's a risk that you might miss a hazard.
There's no warning in this document, as we know there came later to be in the third edition of BR 135 in 2013, that that the results of a full system test on a cladding system could not be used to support the design and use of any different system. It's not there. Do you know why that is?
Probably took that as read. It's a fact, isn't it?
Well, you say it's a fact, isn't it? I mean, it doesn't seem to have been a fact to quite a lot of people until it got spelt out in 2013, and even then questionable, as we've seen over the many months of this phase. Do you know why? I'm asking you for your explanation as one of the authors of this document. There was no warning in it, as there came later to be a decade after, that the past results of a full system test on cladding system A could not be transposed to cladding system B.
I think we just took that as read.
Read from what?
It strikes me as obvious.
Why?
The test of any one thing can't tell you the answer to the test of something else. And if I pass a driving test next week, it doesn't mean to say that somebody else in the room's passed it too. It's just, it seems... Is that a thing you need to write? I don't know. In hindsight, clearly, there'd been enough problems that people have decided to write that. But I think at the time we were working on this, I've got a construction system and I want to get a classification for it. You assume that that's for the system that you're testing and not some other system.
And the way you're telling me this sounds as if it's extremely obvious, so my question is stupid. Now, that may be the case, but what is so curious about this is the fact that I needed to ask you that question at all, given what we know.
I agree.
Right. Well, let's see how that goes later. But coming back to this document, what useful information for a fire engineer assessing the performance of the external wall system in relation to external fire spread does the 8414 test actually give you?
It gives you an indication of the propensity for fire spread on the outside of the building.
I mean, in reality, it's a pass-fail test based on some very limited measurements, isn't it? A single temperature and a couple of time parameters. That's all. Yes? And we can see the criteria.
I mean, if you were a fire engineer wanting to do something more sophisticated, then you'd want more data.
Do you accept that during an 8414 test, a fire directly capable of penetrating the compartment above the seat of the fire can be established on the face of the facade and then spread vertically, and yet the system tested could still pass the test if the temperatures stayed below 600 degrees?
I'm not sure it could, because you'd have flames at the level 2, so it would fail.
Do you know why BR135 in this edition focuses almost entirely on the threat of fire propagation through cavities, but says very little about flame spread over or through the external panels themselves?
I think my recollection is when we were looking at what advice we could give to designers, we looked at the various mechanisms that were known to occur. So fire spread through cavities. I certainly remember having a lot of discussion about cavities that might not be there when the wall was constructed, but would occur during a fire incident. So either the cladding system distorts and creates a cavity, or if you've got thermoplastic insulation, it would melt and create a cavity. So that was something that we addressed and alerted the reader to. There is some discussion about the reaction to fire properties of the external cladding panel or external surface, or the materials that are on the surface of a cladding system. Not as much, and I deeply regret that we didn't mention the issue of composite panels, and I still don't really understand why that didn't find its way into the document.
Well, that's a big question, and you can't answer it, is that right? Given what you knew.
No, I remember sitting down with Dr. Colwell, and we talked through those different phenomena and mechanisms that we thought the reader ought to be aware of. And the composite cladding panel wasn't something that came up, and I don't understand why not, given the results of the testing that we were talking about earlier today.
Right. Well, that's my next several questions. Given the results of the testing we looked at earlier today, given Garner, given Knowsley, given the Select Committee's recommendations, what is the reason? And given also the warning, as we've seen in the 1988 version of this very document, what is the reason why there is nothing about the risks of external flame spread on panels, on Class 0 panels?
I think the document was drafted on the presumption that you were going to carry out the full-scale test. So I think that's why reference to the strengths or weaknesses of small-scale tests wasn't included in there.
But it's not just the strengths and weaknesses of the small-scale test, which is something identified certainly in the 1988 edition. It's also the actual performance of an actual full-scale test incorporating actual ACM of the PE core as one product among others that might have achieved Class 0 and behaved similarly. I mean, it's a yawning gap in this guidance, isn't it?
Knowing what I know now, yes, absolutely.
And we're all searching for the reason, and we're asking the author, and the author can't tell us. Why is that? Why can't you tell us?
I wish I had a better answer. I think I was doing my best to interpret what I was hearing from Dr. Colwell and the experimental team and turn that into language that would be useful for people in construction. And for some reason, which I don't understand, the issue of composite panels didn't come out in that conversation. And to this day, I wish I knew why that didn't happen.
And we know there's no classification system or even failure criteria given in relation to the third performance requirement, mechanical performance. Do you know why that was?
I think it's not uncommon in fire tests to have a clause like that, particularly for things like mechanical failure, because it's so difficult to measure it in a precise way. If you want a classification, you need to have a number that you can put against it in the way that there's, for the temperature limits, there's a clearly defined temperature, height and mechanism for measuring it. So you can be quite precise about the pass-fail criteria. For mechanical failure, it's pretty much impossible, as far as I'm aware, to measure that in an objective way. So that's why it's left to being recorded.
Well, we know that the LPS, I take it you've heard of the LPS standards?
Yes.
The loss prevention standards published by the Loss Prevention Council, 1189. I think that's the right number from recollection, contained not only external and internal fire spread criteria, but also mechanical failure criteria. You know that?
I'm not sure I was aware of that.
Really? I'm surprised. Because the BRE certainly were, and Dr. Colwell certainly knew about those at a later stage. But are you telling us you were never aware of the existence of mechanical failure criteria that had been put about by the LPS in order to support the insurance industry?
For a BS 8414 test?
No, because it's not in the BS 8414 test. That's the point. My question is, did you not know that there were criteria? You said it was impossible to identify them, and I'm putting to you that it wasn't because the Loss Prevention Council had come up with some.
I'm not familiar with them.
Right. Okay. How much attention, or how much time did you devote yourself to your co-authorship of this publication?
It wasn't a big piece of work as far as I was concerned. Dr. Colwell had done the lion's share of this project. I worked with her on the drafting.
What drafting did you work on with her?
Mostly it was the introduction to the document, so the sections that talk about the objectives of the regulations. And I think we discussed the structuring the document to go through the process of describing the different mechanisms.
So can we take it that your role, despite your name as co-author, but your role in this was limited to the shape of the document, the structure of it, and those parts of it which referred to the regulations and the guidance?
Yes, so the diagrams at the front that explain the objectives of trying to avoid the hazards of external fire spread and so on, I drafted most of that section.
Was it your role, because, well, let me be clear, in 2003, were you still working 2 to 3 days a week at the BRE and 2 to 3 days a week at government?
Yes.
Right. And did you have a government-mandated role in relation to BR 135?
No, I wouldn't, because that would have been me reviewing my own work. So that would have been something that officials at the department would have done.
Did you ever discuss with the officials at the department this document, either before it was published or after it was published?
And we must have done. I don't remember a specific conversation, though.
Did you have, or did you hold any brief for the government about what this document should or shouldn't have in it?
No.
You sure you never had any conversations with Anthony Bird about what this document should say or not say, or what it might show or might not show, even in outline terms?
No.
So you're completely sure, are you, that your work, your input into this document was completely free from any actual or implicit instruction or brief from government?
Yeah, we're free to, within the terms of reference of the task that we were set, yes.
Right, I'd like next to turn to something different, which is the amendments to approved document B in 2005 and 2006, leading to the publication of approved document B in its 2006 edition in the April of 2007. That's where we're going. Now, can we start this topic, please, with BRE 401953? This is the proposal, support for the revision of approved document B in the procedural guide, proposal number 112144, revision 4, prepared for the ODPM, and it's dated, as you can see, 23rd of March 2004. If we go to page 3, we can see that it was prepared by you. See that?
Yes.
And signed off for the BRE by Peter Field. Yes, same
Yes.
date, 23rd of March 2004. And if we go down to page 8 of the proposal, we can see the objectives of the work there set out, a number of tasks. And if you look under task 1 near the top of page 8, it says, as part of the revision of ADB, ODPM initially wished to undertake a survey of the relevant stakeholders to identify further issues that they consider may be important to include in the revision of ADB. And then there are some specific objectives set out there. And in summary, they are, first, to conduct a forward-look exercise with stakeholders by a questionnaire and face-to-face workshops and whatever other innovative techniques are referred to. And secondly, to collate all responses into a report, including the BRE's view on merits of suggested changes. Yes?
Yes.
So can we agree, just looking at that the guidance in ADB was supposed to state the Secretary of State's intention in clear terms, which everybody can understand? Yes?
Yes.
That was the aim, I think. And if it was misleading or open to interpretation, do you accept that the Secretary of State's intention in this project was at risk of being misunderstood or undermined?
Sorry, can you rephrase the question?
If ADB, as a result of the amendment, remained misleading or open to interpretation, then the Secretary of State's intention here would be confounded.
Yes.
Yes. And that risk, given that ADB, as you told us last week, was all about life safety, was a potentially lethal risk, wasn't it?
Yes.
Was there any reason at this stage, March 2004, for you to think that any part of ADB was at that time misleading or open to interpretation?
Fire safety is a very subjective subject, all the time I've worked in building regulations as a building control officer or at BRE and in the department, there have always been times where there's been debates over interpretation or application of the rules. I suspect there always will be. It's the nature of the subject. It's very difficult to be categorical about everything. So I don't think here we're focusing on a particular issue. This is just a general good practice objective to try and improve the quality of the guidance wherever possible.
Right. At this time, did you have any particular part of ADB in mind that might be misleading or open to interpretation? This is March 2004.
I don't think so, no.
Let's go to page 10. Section 3, method statement. It says there, BRE will establish a project team consisting of a project manager, Brian Martin, who will oversee all tasks, working closely with the technical secretariat, Sam Greenwood, and a team of technical experts as required, drawn from the Fire Safety Framework Register of Experts. Now, can we take it that you understood that the role described there was your role?
Yes.
Yes. Now, if we go then to CLG 401527, what I'm showing you, Mr. Martin, now is the Forwards Look report that was produced in the July of the same year, 2nd of July 2004, for Anthony Bird. Yes?
Yes.
And if we go to page 2, we can see that the report was prepared by Sam Greenwood for Anthony Bird and signed off by the BRE by Peter Field. Yes?
Yes.
Did you have any involvement in preparing this report?
Yes.
What was that involvement?
I'm pretty sure I reviewed the draft and would have discussed it with Mr. Greenwood.
Right. And when you did that, were you having in mind the objectives we've seen already in the contract?
Yes.
Yes. Can we go to page 7, please? Second paragraph down. We can see there that a series of regional workshops were held in May and June 2004. Did you attend any of those?
I think I attended all of them.
Right, Watford, Manchester and Cardiff. You attended all of them. Now, when we go to page 7, paragraph 5, we can see what happened, what the delegates were given. And they were given a number of topics. If you look down the page, you can see the long paragraph just up from the bottom of the screen, the morning breakout session. You see that?
Yes.
And they were given, I think this is right, a number of topics to discuss in various groups and brainstorming sessions. Yes, I'm summarising.
Yes.
And if you look at the bottom of page 9, we can see the total list of topics suggested. And it says the total list of topics suggested are as follows. And it starts, means of escape for disabled people, warehouses, residential sprinklers, phased evacuation, etc., etc. Do you know by whom those topics for discussion were suggested?
Oh, the way the events were structured is we initially asked the delegates at the event to put forward subjects that they felt needed to be considered in a review of ADB. So they brainstormed a extensive list of different issues. Having done that, we then asked each group to, I think in the form of a vote, to identify their top 10 issues from that list, which was a way of identifying those things that stakeholders for ADB thought were most important to be looked at.
Right. I mean, it's more than a top 10. It's more like a top 100. If one
Well,
goes
so the initial list was unlimited in its number, and then we asked the groups to try and prioritise those because each group was made up of a cross section of there were firefighters and building designers and a big cross section of different sorts, people with different professional backgrounds, and so it was then to try and find where the consensus was of what were the most important things.
I see. What input did you have yourself into considering what topics ought to be discussed at these workshops or putting forward topics for discussion?
And we left it to the delegates.
So I see. So you just left it to them and then you collated their responses?
Yes, we may have had some other issues that we discussed during the day. I'm trying to remember now, but I know a key part of the exercise was to try and get some feedback from some actual users of the document about where the priorities should lie for a review.
Right. Now, if we look down, let's look at the list. It starts at the foot of page 9, the total list, and we kick off with means of escape for disabled people, warehouses, etc. Was this listed in order of priority?
If it doesn't say in the report, I can't remember.
Right. Okay. Well, we can see the first one is means of escape for disabled people. That might or might not give one some sense of the importance of that. But if you turn to page 10, please, turn to page 10 and then run your eye down that and scroll down. You can see about 2/3 of the way down, you can see buried away insulation, issues around polymeric insulation materials and their behaviour in fire. Yes?
Yes.
You can see that. And then scroll on down. You don't see anything, though, that we can see about surface spread of flame or class 0 or diagram 40 or anything like that. Is it because it didn't come up?
If it had come up, it would have been on this list.
Right. Now, in light of the Select Committee's recommendation 5 years earlier, December 1999, did you yourself give any consideration at this stage in your work on the project to the possibility of discussing or putting up as a subject for consultation the retention, or not, of the national classification methods in the approved document, and particularly approved diagram 40 of approved document B?
No, this exercise was all about asking our stakeholders what they thought we should be doing.
Right. Do I take it from the answer you gave us this morning that the Select Committee's recommendation to substitute the full system test for class 0 was water under the bridge, hadn't been logged for being revisited when it came to this round, and was basically a thing of the past?
I think at this stage, that's the approach that we were taking, is that piece of work was done, and it was...
Right.
We'd be updating the references to the appropriate test standard rather than making any fundamental changes.
Now let's go to page 36 of this document, please, which is Appendix A. And this is the list of comments and suggestions for the review of approved document B. And if you go to page 48, within that appendix, towards the top of the page, you can see there's a section B4, external fire spread. You see that? And then it says at paragraph 14.9, the text was discussed at a recent seminar. It causes confusion. Can the class 0 be on combustible material? Now, I don't think we need to go to it, but for clarity's sake, paragraph 14.9 of the version of ADB being discussed related to the status of combustible surface materials as an unprotected area for the purposes of space separation. If you want, Mr. Martin, we can look at that. But do you remember that was in fact the case? 14.9 was about space separation.
I'd need to look at the paragraph. I can't remember.
Well, let's look at CLG 140740. Page 94. This is the 2002 amendments to the 2000 edition, which was then current, and you were revising. or consulting on. And if we go to page 94 in it, please, we can see 14.9. Page 94. Yes, 94. That's CLG 140740. There it is. Thank you. And it's 14.9 under the heading Status of Combustible Surface Materials as Unprotected Area. And you can see the text there. Yes.
Yes. Yes, that relates to fire spread between buildings.
Exactly.
Surface space separation.
Exactly. So that's right. So that's for clarity's sake. Were you going back to the recommendation, or rather to the point that came out of the consultation back at page 48 of CLG 401527, please, if we can skip back to that. You can see what is said there. It causes confusion. Can the Class 0 be on combustible material? Now, were you involved in or aware of the discussions which had led to this matter being recorded?
No. Did
this trigger any wider discussion about the concept of Class 0 or its adequacy, or the interaction of that classification with the definition of limited combustibility at all?
No, I don't remember talking about this.
Were you aware at the time of any confusion between Class 0 and limited combustibility?
No.
Can we agree, if we go through the document, perhaps you can take it from me, that there is absolutely no recorded comment or discussion about what were at the time paragraphs 13.5, 13.6 and 13.7, external fire spread, external surfaces and external wall construction?
That's right.
Right. And no discussion at all about whether Class 0 was an apposite standard for diagram 40 and the meeting of the functional requirement B41?
Yep, no one raised it as far as I'm aware.
No one raised it at all, right. Now then, let's then go on to a fire in Manchester in January 2005. We'll come back to this consultation once we've done that. But I'm going to ask you about the Edge fire. You'll remember that occurred on the 6th of January 2005, yes?
Yes.
And it happened on the external face of a partially occupied block of flats called the Edge, which was in Salford, yes? Yes. And that was during the currency of the contract to support the department with this review. Yes?
That's correct.
And some 6 months or so, just looking at the chronology, after the Forwards Look report that we've just seen, the July 2004 report.
That's
yes?
right.
Yes. Did you have any involvement in any aspect of the BRE's investigation of or reporting on the Edge fire?
No, I remember the people that came back and discussed it with me, but I didn't do any of the reporting.
Who were the people who came back and discussed it with you?
I'm pretty sure Mr. Greenwood attended. I can't remember who else was there.
And when he came back and discussed it with you, was that with your BRE hat on or with your government hat on?
Probably with my BRE hat on,
right.
I guess.
And what did he tell you? You remember?
What I remember is the conversation about whether it was an aluminium-faced cladding system with, I think, a polystyrene, let's call it a core material. I think essentially it was a sandwich panel, so 2 layers of aluminium with polystyrene in the centre. But the polystyrene, you'd normally expect to find polystyrene in the walls of a building because you're putting it there to provide thermal insulation. It's a good thermal insulator. But in this case, its location in the wall meant that it wasn't delivering any thermal benefits to the building. So essentially what it was doing was making the panels stiff. And polystyrene's a useful material because it's rigid and very, very light. And I think the concern was that here was a material that most people would consider to be an insulation material, but actually wasn't being used as insulation, and we needed to take that into account.
Now, this fire was the subject of an investigation of Real Fire's Special Interest Report, or FOSI, dated the 18th of January 2005. You'll remember that, I think.
Yes.
Yes, and it was also the subject of a client report for the department for that period, April 2005 to March 2005. Sorry, April 4 to March 2005, dated 31st of March 2005. There are two reports. Have you read them both? I can show them to you.
I've read them recently in preparation.
Let's go to the first one. BRE 3035368, please. This is the report dated the 18th of January 2005. As you can see, under the date report completed, you can see the investigators were Greenwood and Colwell, date of the fire 6th of January, and then type of building, you can see 19-storey concrete frame block of luxury apartments. Some parts of the building were clad for decorative purposes with sandwich panels manufactured from expanded polystyrene core with aluminium skins, building partially occupied. Now, just looking at that, do you recall seeing this?
It's difficult to say whether I remember seeing it at the time or more recently, but I certainly remember the discussions about it.
Right. Did you discuss the fire before you saw this report or on seeing it, or did you discuss this report with Sam Greenwood or Sarah Colwell? Do you remember?
I remember discussing the incident, probably with both of them, but I don't remember the document.
And if we look at the next paragraph down, location and cause of fire, it started on the balcony at the second-storey level in an area still under construction. And then if you look at the last paragraph on page 1, which gives the details of the fire, it says in the second line, this part of the building had scaffold erect full height, and this also became involved in the fire. The burning timber caused the sandwich panels to delaminate, and once the expanded polystyrene core became involved, the spread of fire up the building was extremely fast. Some reports indicated that the fire spread up the remaining 17 floors in less than 10 minutes. Once the fire had reached the top of the building, it then spread across the top of the roof, and in places had begun to burn down the pitch of the roof on the adjacent side of the building. This downward fire spread is unusual and probably as a result of being driven by the prevailing wind. And then over the page, potential implications for building regulations at the top of the page there. Now, just on what I've read to you so far, if we go back to the foot of page 1, can we do that? When you saw where it said, this downward fire spread is unusual and probably as a result of being driven by the prevailing wind, what did you make of that, and in particular the observation that the downward fire spread is unusual?
So I don't remember this particular document. I'm not sure if I remember a conversation about the downward fire spread in particular.
Did you ask Sam Greenwood or Sarah Colwell about downward fire spread, or why they might have thought that it was a result of being wind-driven, as is said here?
No, it sounds plausible. It's not unusual for the wind to affect the way the flames lean, and that can affect the way a fire might spread.
Right. Well, let's look at page 2 more closely. We go to it, please, and under the heading external fire spread there, it says this: the sandwich panels were fixed to the building, leaving a cavity between the panels and the structural walls. It was not possible to establish during our visit if this cavity had been installed with cavity barriers at floor level in accordance with the approved document B, but Fire and Rescue Service sources believed at the time of our visit that the floor level cavity barriers had been in place. However, it is clear that there was no attempt to provide barriers within the core of the panels, and as such, fire spread through the panels themselves was not restricted. And then it sets out paragraph 13.7 of approved document B, and then underneath that it goes on. Whilst the first general statement warns, You see that after the quotation. Whilst the first general statement warns against the use of combustible materials, the subsequent more specific guidance refers only to insulation material used in ventilated cavities. In the case of this building, however, the polystyrene core was not primarily used for its insulating properties, but rather as a low-cost filler to provide stiffness to the decorative aluminium cladding. The polystyrene core was also not exposed to the cavity. It is conceivable, therefore, that the designers of this building may have taken the view that this restriction was not applicable. It may be advisable to revisit this guidance and consider if more explicit guidance could be given to avoid any confusion in the future. Now, my next question assumes you'd read this, but what did you understand in the second paragraph there by the words, there was no attempt to provide barriers within the core of the panels? We need to scroll up, I'm afraid, to the top of the second paragraph under external fire spread. You can see it says no attempt to provide barriers within the core of the panels. What does that mean? You know?
This goes back to the issue I was talking about that we flagged in BR 135. So this was a polystyrene. I would say insulation, but it's not being used as an insulation. So the core material of the panel was polystyrene. Polystyrene is a thermoplastic, which means when it gets hot, it melts. So in this case, a cavity presents itself, appears as a result of the polystyrene melting and running away. You're left with a gap, and that then provides a route for fire to spread throughout that gap. And at the time, how was this? The issue of fire spread in sandwich panels, mostly in industrial buildings, was a topic of debate. And the best advice was that where you were using this type of panel, one of the approaches to resolving this potential risk would be to put what's essentially a cavity barrier in a location where a cavity would be once the polystyrene melted away. And so they're just reporting here that in this case, the gap between the two layers of aluminium was a continuous run of polystyrene.
Did you read this report at the time? I just need to be clear about that.
I don't know for sure. It seems likely that I would have done, but I can't remember.
No, likely that you would have done. All right. Can we take it that the paragraphs that I've read to you from 13.7 are those in the relevant sections of the 2002 edition of Approved Document B, which was at that stage in force?
Yes.
That must be the case. And do you agree that what is set out there is an accurate summary, indeed a quotation from that guidance? Now, as far as you are aware, how was it concluded by the authors that in this building the polystyrene core had been used not primarily for its insulation properties, but, quotes, as a low-cost filler to provide stiffness to the decorative aluminium cladding? How was that conclusion arrived at?
Given the form of construction and the description that's included here, is that the sandwich panel has been installed in front of a ventilated cavity, behind which is the actual sort of thermal envelope of the building. So because that cavity is ventilated, it's at the same temperature as the outside world. So the polystyrene isn't keeping that space warm because outside air is on both sides of it. So does that make sense? It's quite a difficult thing to describe without drawing it.
Great respect. It makes sense within its... You're asking me a question about whether your answer makes sense. My question again was, do you know how the conclusion was arrived at that the core was not being used for its insulating properties, but as a low-cost filler to provide stiffness? Do you know how that conclusion was arrived at? How
they came to that conclusion? Yes. I don't know. I thought at the time they'd asked the designers, but reading this, it doesn't say that, so I don't think they did.
Did you know at the time what the word filler was likely to mean to those involved in the construction industry, and particularly the facades part of it?
It wasn't a widely used term, I don't think. It was just a way of describing something between something else.
What did it mean to you at the time?
In the context of this document, it means something they put between the two layers of aluminium to keep the panel stiff. It's a filler in that it's not serving any other function. I think that's why they've used that term.
Yeah, you and I can both read the document and draw those conclusions as complete strangers to the whole topic. But did you have a particular view about what the word filler meant at the time?
No.
Mr. Chairman, we are absolutely mid-topic, but we are also slightly late for the break, and I'm conscious that the witness and the transcriber have been at it for slightly longer than is normal. Is this a convenient time for the break, do you think?
It probably is, but just tell me how much longer you think this might have to run.
Well, beyond the reasonable boundaries for a tea break.
Well, that says it all then, Mr. Millett. Well, I think at that point then we should have our break in case we find we've gone on far too long. Yes, Mr. Martin, we'll have a break at this point. We'll come back, please, at 25 to 4 and resume the questioning at that point. And again, as I've said to you before, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence while you're out of the room. All right?
I understand.
Would you like to go with the usher then, please?
Yes, sir.
Good. Mr. Millett, before we rise, there was a question about whether we should seek to make up any of the time we lost earlier on today.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, there is. Would that be...
We don't need to decide it now, but we shall need to decide it before too much longer, shan't we?
Well, yes. If I come back to you at 25 to 4 with an answer, I will ask I will ask the witness if that's acceptable. I'll have the witness asked whether that's something that is all right with him, and I will also ask the transcriber whether that's possible for her and all the other team members as well. But may I ask whether you, Mr. Chairman, are comfortable, given your...
As far as I'm concerned, I'm happy to consider going on until, I would think, 5 o'clock ought to be the absolute deadline.
Yes, it would make it up. That would make up the half an hour we lost this morning. That would be very good.
I can't speak for my fellow panel members because I haven't had a chance to talk to them about it.
No, but I can
you
ask
will have
them.
done.
Yes, well, I'm very grateful. We'll report back in 15 or 14 minutes.
Right, 25 to 4 then, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Millett, are you ready to continue?
Mr. Chairman, we are. We can have the witness back in, please. Thank you.
Yes, hello, Mr. Martin. Are you ready to continue?
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Millett, then, when you're ready.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I've had a word with what you might call stakeholders for the rest of the afternoon about continuing till 5 o'clock. I think people are broadly happy, but it may be sensible to have perhaps a 5-minute rest rather than a full break at about 4:20 or something like that, if that's acceptable to you.
Of course, yes. Well, if everyone's willing to continue until 5 o'clock, that's what we'll do. I do want to make it clear to Mr. Martin, though, that it does make the day long, particularly for the witness. And if he gets to the stage which he feels he can't really carry on and do himself justice, he ought to say so, and we'll obviously stop at that point.
Yes.
All right, Mr. Martin?
Yeah, I understand, sir. I'm happy to carry on.
Thank you very much indeed. All right, well then, we'll do that, Mr. Millett, and I should express my thanks to the stenographer at the same time.
Yes.
And I'll leave it to you to find a convenient point for a short break around about 4:20, whenever it's convenient.
I'm grateful. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Mr. Martin, and thank you, Madam Transcriber. Can I then go back, please, to BRE 35368, which is where we were. BRE 3035368, page 2, bottom part of the page, please, in the last sentence of the main paragraph there, just above fire service considerations. At the end of this paragraph before that, it says, "It is conceivable, therefore, that the designers of this building may have taken the view that this restriction was not applicable." And the restriction is the reference to insulation in ventilated cavities. Now, by the use of the words "it is conceivable," did you know that, as Sarah Colwell told us, neither she, Sarah Colwell, nor Sam Greenwood had actually discussed that question with the designers of the building?
I know that now. Up until recently, I thought they had discussed it with the designers, but I may have had no reason to do that. It may just be something I presumed.
Right. Now, it's in fact correct, isn't it, that the restriction referred to in that penultimate sentence was indeed not applicable, was it?
It's not in a ventilated cavity, and arguably it's not insulation.
Correct.
But it's a material. I think the point they were making, it's a material that you would normally expect to be treated in insulation, and I think they were presuming that that's something that the original authors of Approved Document B at that time were trying to control. I think that's the point they're trying to make.
Well, if, let it be assumed, the designers of this building had taken the view that the restriction was not applicable, that they were correct in that. Yes?
Insofar as the guidance in the approved document is concerned, yes.
Yes. Now, in 2005, given that the polystyrene core of these panels was not insulation, there was no requirement for that core to be a material of limited combustibility, was there?
Well, there was the functional requirement, which set the principal objective, which you would hope that the designers would have taken into consideration.
Well, all right, but my question wasn't about that. My question was that, let me put it by reference to ADB. In 2005, there was no requirement or guidance in ADB for the polystyrene core of these panels to be of limited combustibility.
That's correct.
Yes. They were simply required to have a surface reaction to fire standard of National Class 0 or Euro Class B, weren't they?
That's right.
Yes. Now, when you first read this report, if you did at the time, or at any time afterwards, did you yourself consider whether the panels used at the edge were, in fact, National Class 0 or European Class B, S3, D2 or better?
I don't remember thinking about that. I remember thinking about the fact that there was a material we would normally recognise as an insulation material in a place that you wouldn't necessarily presume you'd find one.
But did you think about diagram 40, though? Is my question.
Not that I recall. I think we were more interested in the paragraph that covers insulation materials.
Do you know why you didn't think about Class 0, diagram 40? What made you think that that didn't bear on it?
I'm trying to guess what was in my mind at that time, and I'm not sure I can do reliably. But I think I would have seen it as the question was more about what we should do with the guidance in what eventually became 12.7 on the insulation materials.
Do you know whether the BRE carried out any inquiries to check whether these panels were in fact Class 0 or said to be Class 0?
I doubt it. That would have been quite difficult to do within the scope of the investigation of real fires contract.
Why is that?
They would have needed several samples to take from the site, which they've got no authority to do.
Could they not ask?
They could have done, and again, they would have needed to come back to the department and sought permission to get the material tested. And I suspect their view was that the key question here was the polystyrene, which the fire behaviour of polystyrene was well known.
Does that tell us that you at least were very focused on the regulation of the core, but not at all focused on the regulation of the external surface and its relationship with the core?
I think so. Yeah, I think we were thinking about the core material at the time.
Yeah. Now, did it occur to you at the time, or to your knowledge, anybody at the BRE, that the Edge building might not be the only high-rise residential building on which ACM panels with a polystyrene core had been installed?
It wasn't ACM. Did you say it was ACM?
Well,
Sorry.
a composite panel.
It's what we would call a sandwich panel because it's
Right.
No, I think at the time we thought it was unusual.
As you say, what we would have called a sandwich panel. Sandwich panel, is that like a term in the industry at the time?
It was a recognised term in the industry at the time. Sandwich panels were used mostly in industrial applications for either internal arrangements, internal partitions in cold stores, or on the external envelope of an industrial building. They tend to be quite thick, so they'd be 50 millimetres plus. Some of them are much thicker than that. So quite a thick sheet, which is why you wouldn't normally expect someone to use it in a place where you're not relying on the insulation, because you're using up space to no benefit.
Yes, we'll come back to that topic in a moment. But my question was about its use at height. My question was, did it occur to you that this might not be the only high-rise residential building on which a composite panel with a polystyrene core had been used at height for cladding?
It wasn't something we discussed. I think our focus tended to be on looking at how the guidance in approved document B could be improved. Right.
So it wasn't a matter you discussed. Let's go to the second report I mentioned to you about the Edge fire, CLG 3019455. This is the BRE's investigation of real fires report, April 2004 to March 2005, dated the 31st of March 2005, prepared for Anthony Bird. And if we go to page 2, we can see that it was written by Martin Shipp, Carol Rock and Sam Greenwood, and approved by Peter Field for the BRE. Did you have any involvement into any aspect of the preparation of this report?
I don't think so. I did get involved in some of the investigations during that period, I think, so it might be that a note that I'd drafted found its way into this report. I'd have to look through the report and see if I recognised any of the incidents.
Well, let's look at page 76, where we can pick up the fire at paragraph 4.1.148. This is the Edge fire here, and it's got some detail. And you can look at the long paragraph there, which contains the detail about the fire itself, and the circumstances 2/3 of the way down, the burning timber caused the sandwich panels to delaminate, and once the expanded polystyrene core became involved, the spread of fire up the building was extremely fast. Some reports indicated that the fire then spread up the remaining 17 floors in less than 10 minutes. And then there's a reference to the unusual downward fire spread again there. And then it says this: it was not possible to establish if the cladding system had been installed complete with cavity barriers at floor level in accordance with the approved document B, but Fire and Rescue Service sources believed that this was the case. However, the fact that the fire burned so readily through the core of this type of sandwich panel means that even if the construction complied with current guidance, the rapid fire spread through the panels themselves would not be restricted. As such, the Fire and Rescue Services have grave concerns that when the building becomes fully occupied, a fire of this nature could quickly become out of control and put the lives of occupants at risk. Were you aware at the time of the Fire and Rescue Service's grave concerns as expressed here?
I don't remember that, no.
Were you concerned by this fire event at that time, Mr. Martin, yourself?
I'm not sure if I put it in anywhere else that identified it as being any different to any other fire that spread in a way that was undesirable.
Well, let's turn back to the foot of page 76, if we can, please. And look there, where it says, even if the construction complied with the current guidance, the rapid fire spread through the panels themselves would not be restricted. Was that something that you knew or picked up from this report at the time?
Must have been something we talked about.
Yes.
And I don't remember specifically talking about that paragraph.
Right. You say it must have been something we talked about. Would it not have caused you some degree of concern to learn that even if the construction complied with the guidance in force, nonetheless you would have this rapid fire spread, unrestricted?
Yes, it must have been something we were concerned about at the time.
Now, the relevant sections of the guidance then in force for external cladding panels, as I think we've established, were the provisions in diagram 40, yes? Yes, you nod, but you have...
No, diagram 40 just talks about the surface.
Yes, the relevant sections of the guidance in force for external cladding panels was diagram 40. There wasn't anything else in. The guidance was there which addressed products or the surface of the products.
In the 2000 edition, no, there was only the insulation exposed to the cavity.
Exactly.
Line, yes.
Yes, and the same in the 2002. You have diagram 40, I think 36 as it was.
Yes.
Yes. Now, did you or anybody else at the BRE, so far as you could tell, consider that this fire and the findings that we've just looked at needed to be communicated to the Fire and Rescue Services or to designers or to builders or others straight away?
At that time, that wasn't something that we took as our role. And Fire and Rescue Services have their own mechanism for sharing risks that they've identified. They've used to be called fines. It's probably called something else now, but they have a secure communication system, so Fire and Rescue Services can share problems that they've identified in fire grounds.
So the answer, I think, to my question is no. Neither you nor anybody at the BRE thought it appropriate to tell Fire and Rescue Services that even though this type of construction complied with current guidance, there was a risk here of rapid fire spread unrestricted through these panels. No one thought to tell the Fire and Rescue Services.
No, I don't think we considered that to be our role at the time.
Well, whether or not it was your role, was it not a sensible and prudent thing to do?
It might have been. I don't know what conversation they'd had with the Fire and Rescue Service. As I say, it's likely that the Fire and Rescue Service may well have raised that with their colleagues anyway.
And when you say our role, who do you mean?
BRE's role.
Right. What about government? You were 2.5 days a week on average in Marsham Street. Was it not your role in government, seconded there as you were, to tell Anthony Bird to say whatever you need to do, you need to get whoever it is to tell the fire and rescue services that there is this regulatory problem?
I didn't at the time. He would have received this report.
Do you remember any discussion along those lines with him?
No.
Were you satisfied that the information in this report could safely remain in the hands of the BRE and the department only, given the clear risk to life that this regulatory defect presented?
I think at the time we were just working within the scope of the project that we were working on.
But the whole point of the Real Fires project was it not, to alert government to risks and defects in the regulatory regime? Wasn't that the point of it?
With the focus on amending the guidance rather than identifying risks in the existing building stock.
Well, what about designers and other stakeholders? Why not tell them immediately that you discovered that there's a kind of sandwich panel out there that complies with the current guidance, but which promotes rapid fire spread up a whole building in less than 10 minutes? Isn't that something that would be pretty important for people designing buildings or building owners who might have this stuff on them to know?
I think in hindsight, yes. I think, but as I say, the way that we reported to the department at the time was very much we reported to the department and left the department to decide what to do with that information.
But why in hindsight? And what was it that you didn't know then that you now know, which makes you wise after the event?
I think if I've learned anything over the last 4 years is that when you identify something like this, you should shout. But I don't think at the time that was the way we worked.
Did you give any consideration at the time after this fire, and while working on the revisions to the approved document, to the adequacy or inadequacy of National Class Naught in and of itself?
No, the issues, the debate about Class Naught wasn't something that arose extensively in my time.
You see, did it not occur to you that one of the reasons why the designers of this building thought that this sandwich panel might meet the guidance was because it might have had a Class Naught badge, or might even have been tested to Class Naught and achieved it? Did that not occur to you?
I don't think that's the way we were looking at it. I think we were more concerned about how do you deal with the internal construction rather than the controls on the surface.
See, all the other high-rise fires that we've looked at in the history up to this point, Knowsley, Garnock, are all fires where, at least some of the reports, scrutinise Class Naught and the question whether Class Naught was achieved. Can you explain why that topic didn't arise in the context of this fire, given the product that was under examination?
I suspect because it's a material that we normally found as being used as an insulation.
So you looked at is this how it worked? I'm just trying to understand the actual thinking here. You thought polystyrene is normally used for insulation, therefore it's all about insulation, therefore we need to cater for that, rather than thinking, what is this product? How has it got onto this building? What is the thinking by which people thought it could meet the guidance, let alone the functional requirement?
I can't remember what was going through my mind or anybody else's mind at that time. But I think we were focused on that question as to how do you control that internal layer. I mean, the subject of sandwich panels had been something that had been debated quite extensively in the industry, and this was a facet of that, I guess.
Right. Can we then go back to page 4, please, in this document? Sorry, I'm looking at the reference. Yes, page 4 in this document. And to the paragraph directly under the list of bullet points there. And you can see there's a long list of bullet points, which are issues in the real fires. And there are a wide range of topics there. And then in the third line down, in the next paragraph down, it says, a fire in a block of flats highlighted the need for fire breaks or cavity barriers in the core of a sandwich panel cladding systems. You see that?
Yes.
Now, that's a reference, isn't it, to the Edge fire?
It must be, yes.
Yes, and if we go up to page 3, and the penultimate paragraph on that page, we can find the following. This is the penultimate paragraph, longish paragraph, middle of your screen. The findings from this period have reaffirmed the overall effectiveness of the building regulations and ADB in providing for the safety of life in the event of fire. Most of the significant issues that have been identified during this study fall outside the scope of these regulations. Now, the first sentence that I've just read to you there, that was demonstrably not the case, was it?
The second sentence that begins most.
No, the sentence, the findings from this period have reaffirmed the overall effectiveness of the building regulations and ADB in providing for the safety of life in the event of fire. I'm putting to you, that was demonstrably not the case, was it, when it came to the Edge?
When it came to the Edge, yes. I don't remember. I don't think I have had anything to do with the drafting of this paragraph, but I'm guessing the second sentence is supporting the first and say that the vast majority of the fires that they looked at, it wasn't the issues with the guidance that was the problem.
Well, leave aside the second sentence. The second sentence we can read and understand. Whether it falls outside the scope of the regulations or not doesn't tell you that the regulations are themselves adequate. That's a different question. I'm putting to you, and I think you accept, that it is quite plainly not the case that the findings from the Edge fire, being findings from this period, reaffirm the overall effectiveness of the building regulations and ADB in providing for the safety of life in the event of fire. The Edge proved the opposite, surely.
I think that's a fair point.
So can you explain how, and I know you weren't the author of this to be fair to you, but how on earth it could be that the BRE could report to government in that way, given what was now known about the Edge fire?
No, I think, as I say, I suspect they're referring to the generality of all the other fires where they hadn't found a problem. But I think it's probably not the best phrased sentence.
Yes. And in fact, do you accept that the Edge fire showed that ADB was ineffective because it didn't restrict the core or regulate the core of an external wall panel to material of limited combustibility, but only regulated the surface to Class 0 or Class B, which is not material of limited combustibility?
That's right.
Now, we looked at the detailed section of the report at page 76, which warned of the danger of rapid, unrestricted external fire spread and a risk to life, even in a compliant system. Do you agree, looking at it, that the fire at the Edge raised obvious questions regarding the effectiveness or otherwise of the guidance in approved document beyond external fire spread?
Yes.
So can you explain how or why that wording came to be in this report here, reaffirming the overall effectiveness, given that the authors were plainly aware of the circumstances of the Edge fire and what they showed?
No, I can't explain it.
And if we go back to the BRE's 18th of January investigation report, please, BRE 3035368, which we looked at before, page 2, at the third paragraph up from the bottom of the page, it says, just above fire service considerations, it may be advisable to revisit this guidance and consider if more explicit guidance could be given to avoid any confusion in the future. Can we take it that, given the amendments we're about to look at, that you agreed with that it was advisable to revisit the guidance?
Yes.
Yes. Now, there's a reference to any confusion. What specifically did you understand to be the confusion referred to here?
Again, it's probably not the right word, really. I think it's avoiding the situation where somebody's using a insulation that's not material in limited combustibility in a location where it's likely to present a risk of fire spread.
Right. Before we leave the reports for the Edge, and looking at what we can see on the screen here, where it says it's conceivable that the designers of the building may have taken the view that this restriction wasn't applicable, did that not ring an alarm bell in your mind that designers were reading the guidance in approved document B as if it were the regulation and taking their eye off the need always to meet the functional requirement, regardless of whether the guidance had been followed or not?
I think that's been a constant problem since the system was introduced. Certainly I remember as a building control officer having to raise issues with designers where they were taking a very pedantic look at the guidance without actually considering the objectives themselves, and they'd even recognise that something wasn't right, but we using the guidance as a defence.
Right. Two things from that, in a way repeating the first question. And did this incident not bring that home? That here are designers which take the view that the restriction not applicable and put a product on the external build-up of a building above 18 metres, and clearly are not taking into account the functional requirement. Did it not bring that dissonance home to you at the time?
I don't remember thinking that at the time, but it probably would have done.
And the other thing that would follow from what you said, it was a constant problem. Did that not mean that whatever else approved document needed to spell out in big red letters to the reader was that even if you met the guidance, you cannot be assumed to have met the functional requirement?
I don't remember thinking that at the time, but it's a fact.
It's a fact, but it's also a fact to which all your experience in your 9 years as a building control officer led you, isn't it?
Yeah, no, I mean, I've worked with designers that certainly did understand that, and others that, for whatever reason, either didn't understand it or used it as a way of arguing a particular point.
Yeah, but given your own experience and given that you're, by this time, positioned with a foot in both the BRE and government, why was this not something that you made it your business to stamp out? This cadre of designers who thought that by complying with the guidance they were ergo complying with the functional requirement.
I think in general, where I could, I did try to apply that approach.
Right. Well, we'll see. Let's go, please, next to CLG 30018832. Now, this is an email to you from Anthony Bird. I'm sorry.
It's an email from me to Anthony Bird.
It is from you to Anthony Bird, you're quite right. 18th of January 2005, copying in Sarah Colwell, Martin Shipp, Sam Greenwood and Peter Field. And this is, as you can see from the date, some 2 or so weeks after the fire, and the same date as the investigation report we've just been looking at, yes?
Yes.
And your email reads as follows. Anthony, having reviewed the recent cladding fire in Manchester and having received a number of technical inquiries on this issue, Sarah, Sam and I have come to the conclusion that the guidance in ADB on external wall construction is in need of clarification. This appears to be as a result of changes in construction practice, whereby the intent of the original guidance has been circumvented. I've attached some proposed changes to the current V12 draft for consultation. This still needs some work as in its modified form, this would prohibit timber frame buildings over 18 metres high. However, we do feel it is important that something on this matter is included within the consultation to ensure that this matter is given due consideration. Happy to discuss. Brian. Now, the recent cladding fire there was the edge, clearly, wasn't it?
Yes.
What was the issue on which you'd had a number of, as you put it, technical inquiries?
I don't remember. The inquiries would probably have gone to Dr. Colwell if it was to do with cladding.
Right. So did you receive them or did she receive them?
I don't remember.
Did you discuss them with her?
I don't remember.
Do you know where they were from?
I don't remember.
Right. Do you not even have an inkling now?
No.
Right. Do you know how long the BRE had been receiving those inquiries?
No, I must admit, in preparing for the inquiry, I came across this email and I don't remember sending it, but clearly I did.
Well, it's not about the sending it so much as the content and the lead up to it, but you don't remember. Now, do you know why external fire spread hadn't been suggested as a topic for discussion and consideration by stakeholders at the Forwards Look workshops in those 3 locations in the summer of 2004? The previous year?
Sorry, could you say the question again?
Why had external fire spread not been suggested as a topic for discussion and consideration by stakeholders at the various Forwards Look workshops that we saw you attended, indeed organised, in the summer of 2000?
I've no idea why they didn't. I think because none of them considered it to be an issue at the time.
So it was completely off radar, was it, at that point?
I think it was, yes. I mean, that's why we hadn't considered it up until this stage.
Now, before this email, had you raised the fact that technical queries or inquiries were being received by the BRE with Anthony Bird or anybody else at the department?
There's a wide range of subjects that people get technical inquiries about. I don't think this was...
Well, on this issue. It says on this issue. A recent cladding fire in Manchester, number of technical inquiries on this issue. And my question is, had you discussed the inquiries on the issue with anybody in government, Anthony Bird in particular?
Not as far as I'm aware.
Right. What were your discussions with Sarah Colwell and Sam Greenwood which led to this email? Do you remember those even in outline?
I can't remember in detail, but I think it was a discussion about what they'd found at the Edge fire and a concern that the approved document allowed that form of construction.
Right.
So as we're saying, you're relying on the functional requirement for something which might well occur more often.
And what was it that was in need of clarification, precisely?
I can't remember from there's a proposed draft. I'm guessing that was my suggestion about how to approach the problem.
And what were the changes in construction practice whereby the intent of the original guidance has been circumvented? What was that?
Again, I'm guessing rather than knowing for sure what was in my mind at the time, or in our minds at the time, but I think it's using a sandwich panel on a high-rise building is something we might not have seen before. And
how had you come to learn about those changes in construction practice?
By Mr. Greenwood and Dr. Colwell visiting Manchester and seeing the Edge.
Oh, I see.
And whatever queries they got, I don't know what their queries the queries were.
I see. So the changes in construction practice is what, a reference to the use of this particular sandwich panel at height?
I think that's what I'm getting at there, yes.
Okay. And you say whereby the intent of the original guidance has been circumvented. What was the intent of the original guidance in that respect?
To avoid to avoid fire spread on the external surfaces of the building such that it would put people at risk.
And how was it being circumvented?
I think you're analysing a sentence that I can't remember writing, and I'm getting to the point where I'm guessing now, and I'm not sure that's particularly helpful.
You can't answer. Did you have any awareness at the time of any other cases where you thought that the original intent of the guidance, as you put it, was being circumvented, as you put it?
Not that I can remember, no.
Did you, or as far as you remember, the department make any further inquiries of Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Services about their own investigation into the fire?
No.
Do you know why not?
I think our focus would have been on the approved document and its guidance, isn't it?
Yeah, but in order to focus on the approved document and what changes you needed to make in order to preserve the intent of the original guidance, as you've described it, did you not want to know a little bit more about how it came about that this panel was selected and what was in the designer's mind in doing that? Which you might get from the Fire and Rescue Services investigation report.
I think if they'd found anything they thought was useful, they would have raised it with us. I think we looked at it as having identified this as an issue with a single building. The question was what you could do generically to improve the guidance.
Yes, you say if they found anything they thought was useful, they would have raised it with us. But this was a contract job for the department about amending or revising approved document B. Did you not want to have all the relevant information at your fingertips, including whether this was a one-off, and if not, Why not? And if so, what the thinking was, which enabled this product to be on a high-rise building, rather than just leaving it to the Fire and Rescue Service to tell you if they thought fit.
Not sure we had the time or resources at the time to do much more than what we'd done. And the thing we were focused on was, what can we do to make this guidance more robust?
Well, you say that I hadn't got the time or the resources. There are 3 of you working on this. What was wrong with a phone call or an email to the Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service Fire Investigation Department to ask for their Special Fires Report or their SAI? You could have done that. Why was that expensive or time-consuming and need lots of people?
If there was one, they probably would have shared it with us already. I wasn't directly involved in that investigation.
Now let's go to GMF 708. This is a letter from Russ James at Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Services, dated the 1st of December 2006, to Sheila O'Reilly at the BSI. Yeah? And if you go to page 3, that's the end of the correspondence run. If you go to page 3, please, you can see that there's an earlier letter, the 23rd of November 2006, from Greater Manchester to Debbie Waddington and Steve Scanlon in relation to the fire at the Edge. And you can look at the first line of the first paragraph, and they say that they are writing to them, Waddington and Scanlon, as the managing agents for the above property, which is the Edge at Clews Street, Salford. Yes?
Yes.
Right. Now, have you ever seen this letter before?
No.
Right. Now, if we look at the second paragraph, it says this: you will be aware of the serious fire that took place within the above building in January 2005. That fire has since been fully investigated, and a number of potential risks have been identified associated with the insulation panels that have been used to externally clad the staircase enclosures. So that's the context. Now, if we go to the third paragraph on this page, it starts with the word "the hazards." Do you see? And it says this: the hazards caused by the combustion of polystyrene is well documented in literature. Coupled with this is the condition of delamination, in which the bonded faces of the cladding separate from the material infill of the panel. When such fires occur within these systems, they are extremely difficult to extinguish, and it's likely that another fire would again result in a total loss of the complete cladding. There is also a proven risk of fire spread in this type of construction, showing that the resulting fire could spread to other fittings, such as the timber decking of the balconies, thus allowing potential fire ingress to dwellings via the patio doors and vents. Now, did you agree? Well, I'm sorry, first of all, you've never seen this before, but do you agree that there was a proven risk of fire spread in this type of construction?
Yes, evidently, yes.
Okay. Now, turning to page 4 and the third paragraph, that says, also over the lifetime of the building, the possibility of an outbreak of fire within any of the flats adjacent to the panelling cannot be eliminated. A flat fire, unless extinguished early, will inevitably breach the patio doors and lead to direct flame impingement on the external surface of the panels. Differential expansion leading to external skin warping will expose and allow ignition of the insulating layer. You see that?
Yes.
And then it goes on. It is acknowledged that the sandwich panels have a Class 0 surface spread of flame rating, and it's accepted that the building meets the requirements of the building regulations, but for the reasons outlined above, Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service have a strong residual concern over the impact that this cladding could have on resident safety should a fire occur again. And then you can see there's a table which contains a recommendation that the building should be reclad using non-flammable core insulation panels. Now, were you aware of any of this in November 2006, which is the date of the letter?
Aware of them contacting the building owner or the risks that they're describing?
When I say this, that the sandwich panels have a Class 0 surface spread of flame rating, and the acceptance that the building met the requirements of the building regulations. Were you aware that that was so, or that being said to be so?
Not in so many words. I think wouldn't have surprised me that it would have been you would have got a Class O classification on a metal face panel. So I guess I would have known that.
If you would have known that, then did that not send an alarm signal to yourself that even though these sandwich panels met Class 0, and therefore the linear route through diagram 36, as I think it was at that stage, nonetheless they would have failed spectacularly to meet the functional requirement?
I think so. As the letter says, the risks associated with polystyrene were quite well documented at the time.
And was this not yet another chapter in the long and sorry history of Class 0, which indicated to you, both at BRE and government, foot in each camp, that Class 0 was dangerous?
Well, I think that's why we wrote that email to Mr. Bird.
Well, I don't think there's anything in the email about Class 0 being dangerous in the email to Mr. Bird, is there? Do you want to get back to it? Do you want to get back to it?
No, I didn't mention Class 0 in there, but we mentioned that we thought that we needed to make that guidance more restrictive.
You see, had anyone made any inquiry of Manchester Fire and Rescue Services, you would have learnt very quickly that these panels had Class 0. And that would have led you not only to wonder about the core, but also have led you to wonder about whether Class 0 remained fit for purpose, and in fact whether the Special Committee's recommendation should not actually now be met in this forthcoming review. No?
Potentially. To some extent, these are two sides of the same coin, I think.
Why do you say that?
Well, both Manchester and ourselves are concerned about the use of insulation cord panels in that location and needed to ensure that people stop doing it.
Two sides of the same coin, but does that tell us that in addition to thinking about how to regulate the core of a composite panel, you also needed to think about whether the Class 0 classification for its surface was also now fit for purpose?
I suppose if you've controlled the core, the Class 0 question becomes less of a problem.
Was that your thinking at the time?
I can't really remember what I was thinking. I'm sorry. I don't want to guess what I was thinking at the time.
Mr. Chairman, can we take our 5-minute rest?
Yes. And I think we ought to save 5 minutes this time because it's just long enough for people to stretch their legs and the transcriber to stretch her fingers. So we'll stop there. We'll resume at 4:25. Mr. Martin, I'm sorry that doesn't give you very long, just long enough to walk out of the room and back in again, I suspect. But anyway, we'll do that now and don't take the opportunity to speak to anyone should it arise, which I think is extremely unlikely. All right?
I understand.
Thank you very much. Right, would you go to the usher, please? Thank you. And I would suggest that maybe the panel themselves might like just to stretch their legs and come back in 5 minutes' time.
Very good. Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. We'll do that. I don't know whether we need to go off air. We probably do. And you can have a stretch as well.
All right, Mr. Millett, if you're ready to continue, are you?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Can we please have the witness back in? Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, Mr. Martin, you ready to carry on?
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Millett, when you're ready.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Martin, we're still on this subject. Did you recommend to Anthony Bird or anybody else at the department at this time, or indeed any other time, that the department might like to carry out inquiries into whether or not the use of these kinds of products, being national class naught, on high-rise buildings was already widespread?
No.
Why not? Why not?
Just don't think that just wasn't the way that we tended to operate. We were just focused on trying to think about how the guidance for new buildings was drafted.
I mean, here you have an example of a compliant but dangerous building. I'd just like to understand why you or your colleagues in the department's first thought was not, well, is this a one-off? Why is that?
I'm not really sure. I think most of the time we were looking at where incidents did occur. We were, as I say, we were thinking about the design guidance, and there wasn't an obvious broader hazard. I don't know why we didn't talk about that more on this. As I say, I think the focus of the project and all of our work was on what we can do with the guidance, rather than thinking about what the broader societal risks would be. I guess we regularly found defects in buildings, and I think that was just regarded as almost as a residual risk, in that there would always be some buildings that were defective in some way. But I'm not sure we thought about that consciously.
I mean, you seem to be drawing a distinction between the guidance and broader societal risks. Is it surely the point of the guidance, which is to guide people to meeting the functional requirement, was all about the broader societal risks, namely the risks of dying in a fire in your own home?
Yes, but as I say, I think we were focusing on how you can improve the guidance to improve the design of buildings in the future, rather than considering the risk of the existing building stock.
Can we go to page 5 of this letter, please? And you can see at the very foot of the screen, I'm so sorry, it's GMF 708, page 5. There, just below the signature, you can see that the letter is copied to Richard Lewis at NHB BCS Limited. Do you remember yourself ever having any discussions with Mr. Lewis, Richard Lewis in this case, or anybody else at NHBC about the Edge fire?
No.
Or your recommendation to the department that the guidance in ADB be clarified? No?
No.
Right. Can we then go back to your email of the 18th of January 2005, please, at CLG 30188832? And in the second paragraph, we've read the first, in the second paragraph you say this: I've attached some proposed changes to the current version 12 draft for consultation. This still needs some work, as in its modified form this would prohibit timber frame buildings over 18 metres high, ! However, we do feel it is important that something on this matter is included within the consultation to ensure that this matter is given due consideration. Happy to discuss. Now, the attachment is at CLG 30188833. If we can look at those, please. Look at that. It says this. And here what we've got, just help me. This is, I think, the 2002 version of ADB, isn't it? Which has got some amendments on it.
That's right. The way we were working on this amendment to ADB was to try and produce a consultation paper that took the old approved document and showed where we were changing it.
Yes, and here you can see B4 external walls, external surfaces was 13.5 amended to 11.5 at the top, yes?
Yes.
You take out the note to file note 9 because that's going to be changed. And then you have external wall construction. 13.7 becomes 11.7, yes?
Yes.
And note while you're there, the second sentence of 13.7 as becomes 11.7. Note it. The use of combustible materials for cladding framework or of combustible thermal insulation as an overcladding or in ventilated cavities may present such a risk in tall buildings, even though the provisions for external surfaces in diagram 40 deleted 28 may have been satisfied. Now, I just want you to note that. But then if you look underneath that, 11.8, you have the original words, in a building with a story 18 metres or more above ground level, insulation or any other material used in ventilated cavities in the external wall construction should be of limited combustibility, see Appendix A. And the words ventilated cavities in have been deleted, yes?
Yes.
Was that your deletion, your suggested deletion?
I believe so, yes.
And after the word insulation in the second line of paragraph 11.8, the words any other material or any other material have been added, haven't they?
That's right, yes.
Yes. Or any other material used. That's new too. Now, do you agree that looking at this document attached to this email, that the effect of these proposed changes you were putting forward at this time would have been to make crystal clear that any and all material in the external wall construction should be of limited combustibility?
Yes, that's what this draft does, yes.
Yes, it's what that draft does. And preserves the warning in the second sentence of 11.7 as well, yes?
Yes.
Yes. Now, if we go back to your email, we've seen it. I think I've read it to you twice. The second paragraph, where you refer to the proposed changes, you say still needs some work as it's in modified form. This would prohibit timber frame buildings over 18 metres high. Now, timber is combustible, isn't it?
Yes.
Can we take it from that and your exclamation mark that you did not intend to prohibit the use of timber in this way?
I think at the time I would have been aware that the department would not have wanted to prohibit the use of timber frame construction above 18 metres.
Right, you're drawing a distinction between you and the department. Why?
I guess I didn't have a particular desire to retain or ban timber construction over 18 metres high, but I was aware the department had an interest in it.
I see. So you were is this right? You were proposing a draft taking into account of what the department wanted.
Yes.
Yes. I see. And who told you that the department wanted not to prohibit the use of timber frame construction over 18 metres?
There'd been quite a lot of work. There was a project called Timber Frame 2000, which was looking at trying to essentially it was working out how you could build a safe high-rise timber frame building, and that was something that the department had been supportive of.
Right, but what was your source of information on that? Was it Anthony Bird? Was it somebody else at the department?
I think it was just a thing that the department had talked about for some time. Timber Frame 2000 was quite a big project.
Right.
The timber frame industry were keen to promote the use of timber frame construction in buildings above 18 metres. I think the approved document had been amended. It was probably 1992 when it had been amended, which had made that easier to do. And this project was really facilitating that. So there'd been a kind of long-running history of the department seeing the potential benefits of using timber frame in taller buildings. So I was conscious that that would be a contentious point.
I see. And was your desire not to prohibit the use of timber frames over 18 metres in your drafting the reason why you considered that more work was required on your draft?
I think that's the point I'm making there, is I recognise that the department probably wouldn't be able to live with that draft in its form.
Right. So just to be clear, is this right, that you wanted to introduce a restriction on the combustibility of materials other than insulation in the external wall arrangements, but to exclude some combustible materials from that proposed prohibition or restriction?
I think that's the universal challenge with drafting building regulations guidance, is there are always exemptions to the rule, and it's trying to find a form of words that does that.
But is the answer to my question yes?
I think so, yes.
Now, you told us a few moments ago, I think, that the core of the panels used at the edge, is this right, should have been of limited combustibility on the basis of the guidance in the approved document? Or do you accept that, in fact, there was nothing regulating the core of the panels at the edge and something needed to be put in?
There was nothing in the guidance at the time that would have clearly prohibited that. So we needed to put something in there.
But timber would already have been prohibited by the guidance, wouldn't it?
Not timber framing, no. Timber frames, we're talking about the structure of the building rather than the external surface.
Right. So how, just explain how your amendment, which is simply the deletion of the words ventilated cavities in, could have affected or could have operated to prohibit timber frame buildings over 18 metres high.
I think it's or other materials included in the wall is the phrase that would have been the problem.
Right.
I think in the original draft that would have been in colour, it would have been blue.
I see. So were you essentially telling Anthony Bird in this email that the approved document needed to be revised to cover circumstances encountered at the edge fire, but without imposing a general requirement that all material, all elements of the external wall build-up above 18 metres must be of limited combustibility?
I guess that's the discussion I'm trying to prompt with this email and the draft, yes.
All right. All right. And if we turn then to the 2006 edition, let's cut to the chase and go to the end of the line here. This is at CLG 1607. You can see from page 1 I'm showing you that this is the April 2007 published version of the 2006 edition of the approved document B coming into effect that month. If we go to page 96, please, paragraph 12.7, I'll show you the whole thing. Insulation materials / products, this is 12.7, in a building with a story 18 metres or more above ground level. Any insulation product, filler material, not including gaskets, sealants and similar, etc., used in the external wall construction should be of limited combustibility. See Appendix A. This restriction does not apply to masonry cavity wall construction, which complies with diagram 34 in section 9. Now, can we take it, Mr. Martin, that you are very familiar with that paragraph?
I am now, yes.
Well, were you not at the time?
I'm more so now.
Right. Now, can we agree that one of the amendments, the addition to the text as against the 2002 edition, was the introduction of the wording filler material, not including gaskets, sealants and similar, etc.?
Yes.
And can we also agree that the previous wording, that restriction applied to insulation material used in ventilated cavities in the external wall construction?
Yes.
Yes, and that got amended in this edition to read only in the external wall construction. In other words, the words ventilated cavities were removed.
Yes.
Yes. Now, after you, so that's where we end up, and we've now got clearly from you what the changes were. After you sent the email of the 18th of January to 2005 to Anthony Bird, did you have any discussions with him about the proposed modified text you had attached to that email?
I'm struggling to remember exactly the chronology of the conversations we had. I think when I sent him that email, the consultation draft of approved document B was in a very late stage of preparation. There was a draft impact assessment that sat alongside that, and a lot of other documents had been produced to get it through the approvals process. And so I think the department had to decide how far did it think it could go in terms of adjusting that draft in the consultation without having to pause the entire project and go back and do more work.
Well, did you have any conversations with Anthony Bird about the contents of your email after you sent it?
We did, but what I can't remember is when they were. All right.
Can you remember what they were?
What I was just saying, I think is that it was bad timing in terms of raising this issue at that point, because the consultation draft was nearly ready to go, and to add a significant change would have delayed the project extensively, I think.
Why was it a significant change in order to cater for the edge problem, if I can put it that way?
Well, I think that was the challenge. Is how far do you go? Is we suggested something quite significant, i.e., all materials in the external wall should be non-combustible, and that would have been, I think, quite controversial at the time, and we would have needed probably to do some more work on the impact assessment, and that would have been needed to have been raised in the clearance documents and so on that had already been prepared, as I recall. So we certainly made some additional changes to the consultation draft, but it couldn't go quite as far as perhaps we'd recommended. Right.
Now, you said in the email, as we've seen, that the proposed text still needed more work, your words, more work. Did you or anybody else at the BRE do any more work?
In
that respect?
I've really great difficulty remembering exactly who did what and when. All I can say is if you look at the consultation draft, there were some changes in relation to that. I think it was taking out the ventilated cavities section, the text where it says ventilated cavities.
Well, let's look at that. 'Cause what I want to do next then is explore the origin of the changes with you and what you intended and understood by them at the time. And we may not finish this exercise this evening, Mr. Martin, but bear with me. We've looked now at the 18th of January 2005 email and the attached draft we've seen, and the proposed deletion of the words ventilated cavities in and the addition of all materials. We've seen that. Can we then go to CLG 6022? And this is the proposed new edition of Approved Document B, Volume 1, Dwellings Consultation Document, dated July 2005. And this is the draft of what became the 2006 edition, sent out for public consultation in July. So 6 months later, yes?
Yes.
Yes. Now, can we take it that you saw this at the time, given your role in the project?
Absolutely, yes.
Yes. And if we scroll gently down through pages 3, 4, and 5, we can see that the document shows the deleted sections in blue. If we scroll to 3 and then down to 4 and 5, can you see that? The deleted and replaced sections are in blue, yes?
Yes.
And new text is in grey. Yes?
It's crossed out. Deleted text is crossed out in blue, and the new text is in blue.
Well, that may be a matter of irrelevant.
Oh, that's how we printed it, and that's how it looks on my screen.
Oh,
I
I see.
appreciate yours might be different.
All right. Now, we can see, for example, that page 3, section 3, flats and maisonettes have been deleted and apartments have been put in instead. Yes?
Yes.
Yes. If we go down to page 147, we find the heading external wall construction. Now then, note that the old 13.7 has now been renumbered 11.6. Yes?
Yes.
But it's otherwise identical, isn't it, to the old 13.7? Yes?
Yes.
It still contains the final part of the sentence, even though the provisions for external surfaces in diagram, what was 40, may have been satisfied. Yes?
Yes.
So can we take it that before this document went out to consultation, you at least were content that this paragraph, 13.7 as becomes 11.6 unchanged, should remain unamended, with the even though words remaining? Yes?
Yes, the key point here is that we brought external wall construction, the heading, to the front of that section.
Indeed.
It's trying to envelop both the surfaces and the materials that might be within the wall itself.
It's been restructured, but
Yes.
it's the same language. It's the same text, isn't it?
Yes.
Yes. Now, if we go then to page 147, fourth paragraph, we can see 11.7 circulated for consultation, and that reads as follows. In a building with a story 18 metres or more above ground level, insulation material used in ventilated cavities in the external wall construction should be of limited combustibility, see Appendix A, and then there's the last sentence about masonry cavity walls. So you can see that it was proposed here in the consultation version that the words in ventilated cavities be removed, but there are no other changes proposed to that section. So the all materials doesn't appear there. Yes?
That's right.
Yes. So as it were, that came in but went out again as a process of the drafting before it went out to consultation.
Yes.
Yes. The wording filler material not including, etc., was not in the published consultation draft, was it?
That's right.
And nor was the proposed amendment, as I think you've confirmed, or any other material after the words insulation. Yeah?
Correct.
Now, let me just put up alongside this the final published version we saw a moment ago, CLG 1607, page 96. So on the right-hand side, we have what was published, and on the left-hand side, we can see what went out for consultation. And if you compare 12.7 as published with 11.7 as consulted on, you can see that the words filler material, not including gaskets, sealants, and similar, etc., do not appear in the consultation version.
Yes.
Do you know why those words were not the subject of consultation?
So, as my recollection of this particular aspect of what was a very large and complex project was that the issue that we raised following the Edge fire was quite late in the day, and the department didn't want to delay the publication of the consultation paper by doing an extra section of work on this subject. So instead of the changes that we at BRE had proposed, it was decided just to strike out the ventilated cavities text, with the potential to revisit this question after the consultation.
What do you mean with the potential to revisit this question after?
So it's something that after consultation, it's something that we could, the department and us as their advisors could look at again and see if there's not something we could do to make it better.
Sorry.
And
Continue.
I remember having a conversation. I can't remember all the people that were in the room. Certainly Mr. Bird was there, where we discussed whether we thought we could do more with this paragraph. The intention was to try and... The challenge we had was that what we wanted people to do was to think more broadly, so that when they were looking at this provision, they weren't reading it too pedantically, and that we were trying to get them to think about, well, it might be insulation or it might be something like it that's presenting a similar risk. Eventually we landed on this language. I think to some extent the term filler had cropped up in some of the consultation responses as being one that was used. We deliberately used the word etc. to try and get people to think more broadly. So we were trying to get people to think about insulation materials and other components of a modern wall that might be proposed that a designer should think about and consider whether they should be materials of limited combustibility or not. So it was trying to get people to think more broadly. So it wasn't intended to be a categorical list of rules. It was intended to try and get people to think beyond just insulation.
Well, we'll unpick that answer when we come to the relevant point in the chronology. My question was a different question, and I think I'd like an answer to it, please, unless you've already given me the answer, which is why were the words we see in the final version, filler material, not including gaskets, sealants and similar, etc., not in the July 2005 consultation?
Because we hadn't come up with those words at that time.
And why is that?
Sorry, this sounds like a glib answer. It was something that we came up with after the consultation, having looked through the consultation responses.
Just pause. You knew there was a problem at the edge, and you knew 2 weeks afterwards that there was a problem,
yes,
which needed to be addressed. 6.5 months then elapsed before the consultation version then went out. Why, during the course of that 6.5 months, could you not come up with some wording that you thought might address the problem that the edge posed?
I think I have said, but in terms of getting the draft consultation paper cleared, I think our suggestion of changes was quite late in the day. I think you've probably heard from some of my other colleagues is that sometimes the internal government machine can slow things down sometimes, and I think in this case the draft was considered to be ready to go, and that's why the department didn't want to make significant changes at that time.
Well, this is very general. I mean, let's just break it up into strict chronology. Okay, so we've got the 18th of January 2005. Okay, more work needed. What was the latest date to which you and Mr. Bird had to work in order to get the final consultation draft ready so that it could then go through the process of clearance and publication?
My recollection is it was very close to the time when we raised this issue with him. I know there's quite a delay between publication, but I think that delay happened after it had gone through the clearance processes.
Right.
I can't remember all the detail offhand.
All right. No, but let's just work it through a little bit harder. You told him that more work was needed. Given that you had a looming deadline, whatever it was, you don't remember, why not just work a bit harder and come up with a form of words which you are satisfied would do the job of addressing the edge problem, on which all stakeholders could then be asked for their views, rather than just leaving it?
I think ultimately that was a decision for the department.
What I want to know is the reason for the decision. What's the rationale for just letting it drift off, rather than actually sitting down at a desk, thinking it through, what wording will work, and putting it out there?
I think this was the quickest way to get the consultation draft moving.
What, not do anything about filler material, not including gaskets, sealants and similar, and just leaving it simply to deleting the words ventilated cavities in?
I think ultimately that's what was decided.
Well, I know it was, clearly, but the question is why?
As I say, I think it was a timing thing, but I can't remember the detail now.
And was the thinking also that you needn't consult on this because you could always come back to it and slip something in unconsulted on later. Was that the thinking?
To some extent, yes. It's not desirable. It's much better to have a clear set of proposals with an evidence base behind them and set out and address it that way. But I think because external wall construction hadn't arisen as part of our initial sort of agenda setting exercise when we did the forward look work, we hadn't had the time to work up proposals, examine the evidence base, do the research and so on to come up with some proposals. So this was what can we do at the 11th hour.
It's always at the 11th hour, isn't it? Have you noticed? So Garnock, June 1999, just too late for that consultation, which led to the 2000 amendments. The Edge, 2005, just too late for the consultation for the 2006 amendments. There seems to be a pattern developing here, Mr. Martin.
I think in relation to external wall construction, I think you've got a point. I mean, the 2006 edition, the project we did on the 2006 edition, we made a lot of detailed changes and we did a lot of work and improved, I think, the approved document in many ways.
So not in the aspect which saved lives.
I can't disagree with you more. We did a lot of work in relation to improving safety. It's external wall construction didn't get picked up in that forward look, or the exercise that had been done by another contractor, which was the backward look, looking at the approved document. It wasn't an issue that got identified as being something we should look at. If it had, we would have done a lot more work on it.
What was it that made it acceptable to your way of thinking that you would leave a potentially important amendment to 12.7 over until after the consultation, so that you would then make a change with no evidence base to back it up?
I'm not sure it was acceptable. It's what that was the option we were given.
By whom?
The department. I was working as a contractor. The department makes those decisions, not me.
Who made the decision in the department that it wouldn't go in for the July consultation but would be shifted off and met later unconsulted?
I don't know how many officials were involved in that. It would have been communicated to me by Mr. Bird, but I imagine he would have talked to other officials.
Right. Now, it's almost 5 o'clock. We are mid-topic. We will certainly not finish it this evening, Mr. Chairman, but it's been a long day for everybody, I think, including the witness and you, Mr. Chairman, I think, and this is probably as good a moment as any to call a halt.
I think that's right, Mr. Millett. I think we've caught up pretty well, haven't we?
Oh, we have? Oh, yes, absolutely. Oh, we've done very well.
Very good. I'm very grateful to everyone who's agreed to sit late and help us to do that. So thank you all very much.
Yes, and that includes Madam Transcriber, who I didn't thank in my list of
Of course it includes her, as well as Mr. Martin himself, and you and your team. Right, well, Mr. Martin, we're going to stop at that point. We'll resume, please, at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. And as I've said to you every time now, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence or anything relating to it over the break. All right?
Yes, sir.
So we'll see you at 10 o'clock tomorrow. And now perhaps we go to the usher, please.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Millett. 10 o'clock tomorrow then, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.